This week's guest is Matt Martin of Smooth River Guiding, familiar face around here by now. Talking about all manner of stuff this year already, from bass to gar to carp, to pike, and we'll be talking some trout and stuff, I know, soon enough as well. So Matt, welcome back to the channel.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the intro. Love it.
Absolutely. So we're talking cottage country pike today. That's fun.
Yes, specifically like the spring fishery. It is the best time of year to pattern them and figure out where they're going to be. They're predictable. They relate to water temperatures more so than most species of fish that I know. When you're getting out there at ice out, and then just beyond ice out, those first few weeks, I'd say 80 to 90% of the fish are all up in the bays, like in the whole lake. So even if you've never been to a lake before, just taking 5 minutes to look at a chart, or even just Google Maps and identifying where those bays are, it's a fantastic fishery that most people can, with a little bit of information, can find success fairly quick.
And there's no shortage of options up there too, right?
They're if you go to talk to anybody in Northern Ontario, pike are a nuisance fish.
Yeah, exactly.
They're eating all the walleye. That's like the number one thing you hear.
Yeah,
there's lots of them, and that's a great thing. They're a native fish. They're a lake that has pike in it. That's they're the apex predator in most lakes. They're right up there with muskie, even in lakes where they compete. They occupy their own niche though compared to muskie. They're a little bit different. But they're sure they might eat some game fish like walleye and bass, but they also contribute to a healthy ecosystem by removing weak genetics and managing the fishery without us having to manage the fishery. So as long as people practice catch and release with them, I find, because they do take a little while to get big. A lot of people don't realize how long they can live. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with keeping pike. There's lots of them, but if you find your lake has stunted fish, it's probably due to a lot of catch and keep and fish not being able to reach their maximum size. I will be the first to admit though, they taste great. And if you do get one that's hook deep, fry it up next to a walleye and you'll never know the difference. Fantastic sport fish, and on the table, pretty good too.
Sweet. All right. Well, you want to throw your stuff up there, and we'll get going.
Let's jump into it. All right. And let's screen share. Perfect. All right. How's that looking, Chris?
Looks awesome. And a reminder to everyone that if you have questions, you're very much encouraged to ask them. Just use the chat function. So keep yourselves muted and just use the chat. We'll answer those questions as they pop up.
Great. Yeah, please ask questions. It helps me, remember where to continue on, and then not just burn through topics. It helps everybody get their answers as they want them. So please interact. It'd be great. So like as we spoke about before, today's topic is fishing for spring pike up in cottage country. So predominantly Muskoka, Haliburton, Georgian Bay. It's kind of where I'm gonna focus on. There's fantastic pike fishing all the way down in Toronto Islands though. So don't forget about that. Like right on Lake Ontario waterfront, there's pike as big as that or bigger cruising the harbor. So they're readily accessible species. You can't really beat them, and they're just mean looking. So pretty fun. So kind of how I started last presentation, I do want to go over, for those of you that aren't familiar with lake types. I'm not going to dive into them, word for word here, but the interesting thing about pike is that they can thrive in every environment. Every one of these lakes, oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic, they can all hold pike. Unlike lake trout, for instance, which are predominantly oligotrophic, a little bit mesotrophic if there's some colder water refuge, or largemouth bass, which are pretty much just eutrophic and a little bit mesotrophic. The pike can thrive in every single style of lake. However, it does change the way you target them and how they grow, and I guess maybe the population density also changes. So the oligotrophic lakes, they're always the deepest, coldest granite lakes. They're low in nutrients, low sediment, usually really clear due to poor or little sediment floating around. They can still be really tea stained. Pike can really thrive here if there's a large forage base of smelt, ciscos, or other things like that. Even lake trout, pike are notorious for hanging out in deep water. I've caught them downrigging before over lake trout areas where you're 60, 70 feet down and you're catching pike. Like it's crazy. So those fish, though, they do tend to take a while to grow. I'll talk about how long pike live in another slide, but they can tend to live longer in oligotrophic lakes. And the population density tends to be a little lower, as it is with most species, excluding trout, it seems, that really thrive in them. What you would want to focus on is fishing, maybe white bait fish patterns, things that are kind of white bellies that look like a cisco or a smelt. Those are probably going to be your two main forage species. As with most fish that occupy the, I don't want to call them like, pike aren't really a warm water fish, but, in terms of our description, they are. They're not as cold thriving as like a trout, but they do require water in that like less than 70-degree range, so similar to a trout. However, they can live in warmer water. In mesotrophic lakes where that water temperature fluctuates, let's talk about Georgian Bay. It's majority of it on the east side is mesotrophic. There is portions of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay that are obviously oligotrophic, but that's where you're going to find larger population densities with large fish still in there. There's lots of room for those fish to cruise around. They do require quite a large area for territory for them to get big. If there's not enough territory for the fish, so use like, I don't know, a small little pothole lake as an example, that's probably just full of pike, but none of them get over 2 or 3 pounds. That's just because there's not enough room for them, but there's lots of food, right? So frogs and things like that, like a eutrophic lake, but a mesotrophic lake is usually the go-to. So pretty much everything you got up in Halibut and Muskoka, those are your, with exceptions, obviously, but anywhere you've got some plant life growing in the back bays, cabbage beds, which are key, bait fish that are, including small panfish, leeches are really important food to pike, especially in the spring. And then you're going to start seeing amphibians and stuff like that taking up, and even insects. So when you're looking at like young pike, so there's a lot of documentation about young pike when they first hatch, actually feeding on inverts, and slowly, not slowly, fairly quickly transitioning to small bait fish, but they will eat insects. And then eutrophic, they're the shallowest of them. They're extremely rich in nutrients, often cloudy and muddy. They often look like the perfect pike bay, but it's the entire lake. So those perfect soft muddy bottoms for pike, just think of that. That's what this whole lake looks like. They often have poor dissolved oxygen levels due to algae, and they can do well there. Like they can definitely thrive, but your average size is going to go down. However, population density is going to go through the roof. So there's plenty of lakes out there where you're just like, I can't catch a big one. There might just not be big ones in there. So keep that in mind. Don't beat yourself up if you've been fishing the same lake for 20 years and you're like, my biggest pike is 32 inches. What am I doing wrong? Well, that might be the biggest pike in the lake. From research states too, through surveys with the otolith bone in their heads, that the colder the water, the longer they live. So the longer they live, the more chance they have to get big as well. So I think I was reading something, I won't quote it, but something about Georgian Bay and some of the pike that are in that 40-inch range are only in the 7 to 10 year age, which is just crazy. They have the opportunity to grow so big so fast. When their max age is in the wild is like 25, but most fish only sexually mature at like 6. So it's kind of crazy how fast they grow. So that gives me a little bit of, introduction to life history. We want to start right from the beginning, how, pike, where they are every time of the year. So pike they're a spring spawning fish. You'll often hear that, pike spawn under the ice. And while that has been documented before, majority of the time around here, it's when the water temperatures hit 40 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly. So ice off and then probably a couple of weeks in. You will start seeing pike immediately in the shallow bays following ice off. They usually or up there when it's ice covered as well. However, they aren't usually spawning until the water's 40. Generally that occurs from, like late March through to May, but depending how far north you go. I know when Nick and I and my dad he actually caught this fish right here. It's up on Nipigon. We were seeing spawning fish the first week of June. So depends how far north you go. That'll dictate where they are in the spawn. So the one important thing about this and why people, I know they always say they're eating all the fish, they're taking over the lake. It's because they're the first spawners usually. Those fish get a head start, especially when there's direct competition with another estock species like muskie that spawn quite a bit later. Those pike are already feeding on small bait fish by the time bass are spawning, by the time walleye are spawning, by the time muskie are spawning. So that's what allows them to become such a dominant species in the body of water. They are voracious when they're young. They grow quick. The average fish grows, 25 inches, up to 20 inches in its first year, and then it continues. So a 20-inch fish in 1 year, that's pretty wild. When you think of trout, that would probably take 6 to 7 years, and bass, that's going to take 15 to 20 years. Pike grow quick. That's also why, they're an awesome fish to harvest. Like, I didn't have that in there, but like keeping those sub 30-inch fish isn't a bad thing. That's a good thing for yourself and the fishery. One interesting thing about them, all esox species are what they call broadcast spawners. They don't create beds or redds. I've witnessed this many times. It's really cool to see. They go right up in the shallowest water, often bulrushes, cattails, shallow cabbage beds, milfoil, anything where they can swim through the shallow 1 foot of water. And you'll see a single large female, often with 1 male, maybe 2 or 3 males, which are often quite a bit smaller, swimming with their sides touching. They are right together. You'll see their fins out of the water, and they have absolutely no interest in flies usually, unless you can tick one off. And in some areas, their pike are open all year, so you can fish for them while they're spawning legally. There's nothing wrong about it. But they're really hard to catch if they're spawning. Like, they're not feeding. Keep that in mind. The only reason they're hitting is you got too close to me. And it's actually quite amazing to watch them spawn. It's quite an aggressive spawn. Like, we watch trout and they tear up their fins from building redds, and the odd male latches onto another male to push it around. But you're going to catch most fish tore up. they're going to be a little bit of bleeding. They're going to be missing scales. If you've ever looked in a pike's mouth, they've got no shortage of teeth. So when they latch on to a competing male to push it out of the area, it causes quite a bit of damage. So it's pretty interesting. You can see where you are in the spawn by the condition of the fish. The pre-spawn fish are just big and fat, and the post-spawn are scarred up and thin. There's been plenty of times where I've been bringing a pike, like a decent pike in mid-30s, to the boat, and another one hits it because it just gets too close to it and during the spawn. So it's pretty wild to see that. So while they're spawning, which they're just swimming through these shallow bays, releasing eggs and milk, the eggs just kind of free float and attach themselves because they're quite sticky to vegetation. And they're a quick incubation period, 12 to 17 days, a lot quicker than what happens with our steelhead, trout, salmon, where the eggs are under the rocks for 20 to 30 days, and then they still live in the rocks for a while as an alevin. These things immediately hatch and start feeding. Young pike grow rapidly. They start feeding on invertebrates and small bait fish pretty much immediately after hatching. And I remember when I've actually watched, where is it, at the Fleming school or Sir Sanford Fleming, where they do all the muskie program, watching what they feed them at. Like, they're eating like 2-inch bait fish when they're like 6 inches long. Like, they're not shy. They're pretty cool. One interesting thing is the females will hang out in the extreme shallows for a few days after the hatching takes place. So they're going to hang out there, they're going to warm up, they're going to recover. And by extreme shallows, I'm talking a foot of water or less sometimes. And the males will hang out there a little bit longer. So if you're fishing the first week after opener or something like that, early May, and you find you're just getting small fish, maybe you should move out a little bit. The females might have already moved out to that 2 to 4 foot range. And keep in mind, they don't guard their eggs like bass would. They just do their business, recover, start slowly feeding again, and then move on out. Once pike do move out to the 2 to 6 foot deep sections of the spawning bays, they really start to feed. That's when they're in full recovery mode. They're trying to, heal themselves, trying to bulk back up for a busy summer. At that point of the season, it does matter according to the day what you throw, but most of the time, if it's smaller than their head, it's a target. And like I said, I've seen 30-inch fish get hit by a slightly bigger fish just out of aggression. So don't be afraid to try small flies, but also don't be afraid to try big flies. And then male pike mature pretty quick, 4 to 5 years. They're already spawning, and female in about 6 years. And they both can live up to 25 years in the wild. Although I was reading something quite interesting. There's been pike in captivity that have lived over 50 years, which is crazy to think. Just a simple fish can live that long, but they don't get enough credit, is what I'm trying to say.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I have one question. So asking if pike change color when spawning.
It's not like like our trout species where they've developed obvious colors. I think it depends on the lake. I've seen slight variations in colors, but I think that might just have to do with the fish themselves. I've seen them appear more reddish in the fins, where there might almost be blood coming out of the fins, and that's not really due to. A lot of people might think, oh, it's got netted before. It's just like the fish is super stressed, and you'll see that in pike and muskie when they're caught. They often will bleed from the fins. They're a very vascular fish. They're a top predator. They do tend to show stress in different ways. Like bass will almost get darker when they get caught and when they're spawning. Pike tend to stay the same color, but I think it depends more on the body of water. So if it's a clear lake, they're going to be more of that gray, white, kind of silvery color. Getting into those tannin colored lakes, a little more green and yellow mixed in. But yeah, often, a straight white belly. I can't say I've seen any color myself. That might be a better question for a biologist. Unfortunately, I just don't have an awesome answer for that. But I've never witnessed, an obvious difference from 1 week to another post spawn or pre-spawn.
Yeah, can't say I have either.
I think
But
right,
there is like a wild range of colors. Like there's silver pike and blue pike too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that.
Weird fish.
It totally depends on the forage base, and there's probably, I don't think there's been that much study. There's not nearly as much study have gone into subspecies in warm water fish. Maybe there's been a lot in bass, but like you think of trout, and I was watching something today and it was like the 7 species of cutthroat or something. And I'm like, how many species of northern pike are there? There's probably quite a few like subspecies that we don't even really know about. All you hear about are northern pike and silver pike. And silver pike are really rare, are around. But yeah, I've seen them, like you said, Chris, silver and blue colors, extremely green and yellow on the belly to white on the belly, gray on the sides. Some of them have like really long oval spots on the sides, and some of them are just more like little tiny, like round spots, the entire body. Might have to do with, the actual strain in that lake. Yeah. So that was a long way of saying I don't really know if they change color when they spawn.
They aren't boring, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So what basically areas you want to kind of start? Where do you start? So like I said, it's pretty straightforward when you're looking on a map. You're looking for those shallow, dark bottom, south-facing bays, something to keep in mind. Obviously northern hemisphere, sun is always slightly south. We're getting at that time of year. So we're getting warmer water. The right aspect on those bays will warm up faster. They're going to be the first ones to warm up. They're going to attract fish that are either pre-spawn, post-spawn, whatever. They're in there to also help. There's going to be bait fish around. They're cold-blooded, so they're going to warm up, start their metabolism, kickstart it, and get them feeding. I personally would, like, if I'm fishing and I got numbers on these different maps and charts, the way I kind of look at pike, I guess, in Southern Ontario's standards, opening week on Georgian Bay, for instance, is May 1st. So kind of think of the numbers as in the weeks. So the first week I'm fishing pretty shallow. So on the right side, you're way up in that bay. there's like you can see an actual like river coming in on the right side above it. I'm going to get right up top. Those rivers will often attract spawning fish like suckers and walleye that often use rivers to spawn. And the pike are going to be right there, kind of gatekeeping the rivers and looking for weak individuals. As the weeks progress, the second week, you're going to start working those transition lines. So those first immediate, getting those first points outside of the bays. Maybe now they've moved from the south-facing bays, and now they're moving into all the bays, getting in there and spreading out a bit more. So on that bottom left map, number 2 is all on the bottom now, as the water temp is a little bit more uniform across the entire bay that you're fishing. And also break down the water. If you're on a big lake like this map on the bottom left is from a very large lake up in Muskoka, and that bay is the size of some lakes. So feel free to just break down those bays as an own body of water. They might even have their own resident population where the pike never leave. So kind of think of them like that. Start, if you've never fished a lake before, start up shallow and on south facing bays. And then as the weeks progress, and start to explore and really get to learn your section of water. As the third week comes around, we'll use the bottom right map as an example, the chart. You're going to see the first major drop-offs, those points. Those are at, like I mentioned, gatekeeping. Those fish are going to move out, get closer to deeper water where they're going to be happy come mid-spring, early summer. And they're going to catch all those walleye and suckers that are coming back down. I always like to look for natural funnels when I'm thinking about pike. I'm kind of going ad lib on my notes here, so I apologize if I'm bouncing around. But they're a lie in wait predator. They don't cruise really looking for fish. They're going to find an ambush point and they're going to sit there. So find those areas that look fishy, as generally speaking. If you just hit enough of them, you're going to find some good fish. Having access to deep water can be really key. And by deep water, it doesn't have to be a ton. Like this map on the bottom right, well, you've got 55.8. That's pretty deep, but there's no reason why pike won't go down there in the summer. But having even on the bottom left map, so I'm bouncing back again, there's still 14, 15 feet of water in that bay. So those fish can easily move out there and find some comfort in cooler temps into late May, when that water temp's probably starting to get into the 60s, somewhere around there, upper 50s, low 60s.
I'm thinking about like if somebody, they had a cottage up there in the summer and realizing it's not a great time to be on some of these waters, you got to figure a spot like that bottom right, maybe with that steep break, but access to shallower bays where forage might be hanging out. That might be like a good early morning or low light spot.
You got it, man. That bay on the bottom right is like one of my favorite bays in all of Southern Ontario. Like it always has big fish in it seems. Like you mentioned, access to deep water. And one thing that's not in here and it should probably talk about is once that water gets up into the 60s, it's not only not that comfortable for the pike, it's now too comfortable for humans. And you're going to start having jet skis and wakeboards and water skis and tubes going. And these fish tend to get spooked pretty quick and get out of the shallows. So that's why, we really focus on that first few weeks of the season. There are, if you can get up there before the May long weekend, that's usually the best time of year if your season allows it. Some of the lakes up in Muskoka, most of them don't open until the third Saturday in May, so a little bit later than Georgian Bay, for instance. But that first week can be really good still when the water's cold, and not everyone's opened their cottage yet, so it's kind of key too is get up there early before they get spooked out, because I'm sure most people, if you've ever spent any time on lakes in Muskoka, most of the lakes, they don't have 100 feet without a dock. Right? There's always, even in these back bays, like you can even see on the aerial view on that top right, one of my favorite bays, there's like a very large cottage right there, right? Which can be really strange when you're fishing around these gigantic cottages and yachts, basically, and you're catching pike in these shallow waters. But it's part of why it's such a short season is how populated these lakes are. If you can get out into Georgian Bay now, or you can separate yourself, out in Thousand Islands area, get away from a lot of it, you can find success later into the season. Also, the water tends to stay a little colder. It keeps them up shallow longer. So to go back to kind of where I'm supposed to be saying, So structure that we're looking for, that's really key. You just can't go into a back bay and you just go into a back bay like this middle one here, which is basically a shallow sandy bay, and probably find fish, but you need to find some sort of structure. They're not cruising weed flat, or they're not cruising, mud flats and sand. They're finding vertical structure. So, growing new growth weeds, fallen trees, even large rocks. First off, they all hold heat, but those standing new green weeds are producing oxygen like crazy. And because they're a lion weight predator, and when they accelerate, they're incredibly fast. They need to recover, so they need well oxygenated water, cooler water, so they'll actually recover faster. They will still hold on dead brown weeds, but the problem with that is not a lot of bait fish does. So, you might see the odd fish there. Don't overlook them, but if you can find green weeds, that's key. Lakes that have a lot of forage fish will hold larger pike. That kind of goes without saying, more food for them to grow bigger. But a lot of people don't think that. If it's only sunfish and perch in your lake, they can probably only get to a certain size. But if you're now incorporating walleye or smallmouth or ciscos or something like that, you're going to have a much larger population, or much larger potential for your fish. Generally speaking, the further north you go with pike, the bigger they get. They all have the opportunity to get that big, but your average size increases. And they're also in these shallow bays because the warmer water, number one, increases their metabolism. And it also happens to be when the suckers and walleye are in there spawning, so lots of food around for them. So yeah, when I'm basically to go off topic, ad lib again a little bit. Utilize, I talked about it in my previous presentation about bass, utilize the free resources online. I think you can get Navionics on your computer for free. There's lots of chart viewers online that'll give you up-to-date charts of the lakes. If you have it in your boat or you have the app on your phone, it's great to just look at when you're sitting around doing nothing. Just take a look at your charts and start to draw pins or areas you might want to check out. Google Maps is great because even if you look on the top right photo, you can actually see the structure there. Like, that's a shallow sandy flat on the left into a deep trench that goes right up to a river. Like, it's kind of cool. You can even see weed beds. I'm circling them with my mouse, but you can't see that probably. But there's lots of little weed beds right off that first little point, and then a nice dark transition zone all the way back to that river. So it's amazing what we have at our disposal. And the great thing about pike is, especially the first couple of weeks, if you can find shallow warm water, you're on the right track. You should do well. All right, next slide. So there's a good picture of my good friend Nick. Don't be afraid to get right up in those weeds. You can see where we were wading this section. It was such a shallow river mouth. You were just kicking up dust with the electric motor so much driving around, so we just decided to jump out of the boat. And he's kneeling there with that fish, but I think we were in a foot and a half of water in that heavy weed growth. And those fish, that's a pre-spawn fish. It's nice, healthy looking, no scars. Probably a female, at that size, that is just sitting there waiting right along the shorelines for something to fall in or to swim up shallow. So it's I'm not usually utilizing weedless flies too much, but it couldn't hurt. Usually the material, like if we look at a quick little, like a Buford fly or something, the hooks are all kind of hidden a little bit with the bucktail, kind of keeps them up high in the water column and out of the weeds for the most part. But short casts, accurate casts are key. So I'm going to go into forage a little bit. We touched on it briefly, but here's kind of what I'm looking for in a lot of the Muskoka lakes. Leeches are often the first major food source that's available to the fish. If you listen to anybody talk about spring pike, they'll probably talk about their number one fly being something small and black. So a good one that I'll use is like the Whistler fly. Actually, I tied this one with you, Chris, the one day. It actually has proved to be very effective. Whistler in all black, or a black bunny leech is a great option. You notice that it's not very big. It's only 4.5, 5 inches long. That's all it really needs to be. It's a size 2/0 hook. It's not giant compared to some of the other flies we'll throw. Great thing about these, you can throw them comfortably on an 8 weight. So there's nothing wrong with fighting most pike on an 8 or a 9 weight. Those larger flies, you need to look at 10 weights, but these leeches are probably the first food source that is plentiful. They're easy to catch. They move slow. They're high in protein, and pike love them. They can just swim up slowly behind them, open their mouth, suck them in. Those fish don't need to chase them. However, probably over the course of the season, minnow species, like anything under the Cyprinidae family, so shiners, creek chubs, suckers, all those are under the same kind of family. Soft rayed fish are likely number one for most lakes. They're easy to for them to swallow, unlike a perch lower with no spines. They can take them. There's lots of them. Suckers group up like crazy early spring. I'm sure anybody that's a steelheader has seen that in the rivers, but it's also true in the lakes. So finding river mouths or rocky bottoms in a lake, you'll often find groups of suckers spawning. Pike are usually holding right alongside them nearby and just picking off the fish as they leave the school. Thing about suckers is they can get very large. 4-pound fish is nothing. You get white suckers, even some red horse suckers in that 10-pound category. Obviously, they're not going to be high on the food, or not going to be preferred forage when they're 10 pounds. But those 1/2 pound to 1-pound fish, those are really perfect size for a pike to eat. That's a 10 to 14-inch fish, and comprises most lakes I fish a large percentage of their diet until the summer. Most of our lakes in Muskoka and Haliburton have invasive yellow perch, and they've gotten in through introductions through bait buckets, and they take off. Small 3, 4, 5-inch perch are easily replicated. So like anything that's green, that's barred. This is a single yard sail fly, actually. It even incorporates foam underneath the laser dub to allow it to ride really close to the surface and have a good waking action. But you notice it's still pretty small. It's only in that 5-6-inch category, but looks kind of like the idea of a perch with the barring and the yellow and the chartreuse. Is as a deadly fly. And those perch, if in most of those lakes where they're invasive, they don't get all that big. You're not finding 12, 14-inch perch. You're finding mostly small ones. So perfect forage for a northern. And then some other forage that I want to talk about that maybe isn't always as important in the spring, with some exceptions, but cisco and smelt, they're generally a deep water fish. But at certain times of the year, they, like generally summer, the pike will move deep and really start to predate on them. One exception I find is with smelts. If you have a large population of smelts, they run up the rivers in the spring just to spawn, and they die after spawning. So there's lots of dead smelt rolling around, and that are easy to pick up for pike, and also the smelt that are staging. So really accessible food source even in the spring. And then game fish, well, they do eat all the walleye. Walleye, young of the year walleye, spawning walleye, they can be high on the forage list depending on the lake you're on. But one thing a lot of people don't think of is young of the year pike. So last year's fish, they're really high on the forage base. I've kept quite a few pike in my day. They take flies deep. I said they taste great and they're plentiful. So if you want a shore lunch on a northern lake, pike are great to take home. A lot of them have young pike in their belly, so keep that in mind. Fish a lot of like olive flies. White and olive represents anything. Like this one here could be absolutely anything. It's white olive, a little bit of grizzly hackle, could be a small northern, could be a walleye, could be a perch, could be whatever. But even in the conventional game, you'll see a lot of pike looking lures. They're like made to look just like pike, so they do feed on them quite aggressively. They're a cannibalistic fish, and they're not afraid to let us know that.
Thinking a little bit later into the season, as those, cisco or smelt are maybe a little bit deeper, schooling a bit more, do you find that the pike follow those schools actively, or
Great
they
point.
just yeah?
Yeah, I think especially once the ciscos start to move up to spawn in the fall. I mean, it's no longer the spring anymore, but they do. I've seen it quite a few times out muskie fishing when you think you've found a monster muskie on your graph, because you've trolled over a giant school of ciscos and there's like arcs everywhere around it, and you get pike. They do follow them. Like I mentioned, how they are lion weight predators for the most part of the year. They are. But when the bait fish start to group up and school up, usually they're not far behind.
Right.
Yeah, you're just not going to see them like a pelagic kind of fish where they're chasing bait fish out in the middle of the lake for no reason, right? They're lazy. They're waiting for food to come to them, which is great for us because if you can just find good visible structure, you can usually find a pike. So one thing I always get asked, especially when people are booking trips, is like, what do I need for gear? Well, there's a lot of specific gear on here that might not be familiar to the traditional fly angler. When they're looking at this, like, oh, why do you need bolt cutters? Well, I'll get to it. But the first thing you're going to want to have is a 9-foot, 8 to 11 weight fly rod is probably the standard. A lot of people would say a 9 weight to 10 weight is perfect. Base it on the size of the fish that you're targeting. If you're throwing, 10-inch flies to 40-inch fish regularly, 10, 11 weight is probably a good idea. But if the average fish in your lake is sub 30 inches, and you're fishing 4 to 6 inch leech patterns, like go with an 8 weight, have fun with them. You can totally handle them. Even if you catch a freak 40 incher, 8 weight will still handle it. I've caught plenty of them, plenty of big ones on my 8 weight when targeting smallmouth or even just smaller pike. Just like in my bass presentation, the reel is more just about balancing your outfit. Get something that's large enough to balance your rod while casting so you don't develop shoulder fatigue, but it needs to be able to handle the large diameter of the fly line that's needed. So an 11 weight reel, usually is quite a lot of line capacity because the line's quite thick. It's as simple as that. You're not putting them on the reel too much. I mean, plenty of times I've been put on the reel by a fish, but if I hook them on the strip and I'm 20 feet into my strip, I'm not picking up the fly line. I'm just stripping them in. It's usually the number one thing. Most times people lose them is when they pinch the line between the cork and try to pick up 20 feet of line. The line goes slack and the fish comes off. So just keep stripping. We're using, sure to say, pike and muskie taper fly lines are a good option. Lots of them out there. Rio makes a great one. I've seen lots from other companies as well. They turn over large flies easily. They're not the most delicate presentation by any means. They tend to be a little loud and slap, which isn't a bad thing because that does draw attention from a predator. The big thing is short leaders. So I run a level leader to my fly line, usually 3 feet of it's usually 2 to 3 feet of 30-pound or 40-pound nylon, and then 1 foot of 20-pound, which is just like a break off section. So if you snag on bottom, you're not going to strip your fly line core or rip the line to pieces because most cores you're going to find are 30-pound break strength. So go with 20. And then a short section, probably start at about 18 inches of bite wire because you're going to be retying lots as it gets too kinked and it starts to affect the action of the fly. There's lots of different wires on the market. The Rio wire bite's great. There's titanium ones out there. The thing with titanium is I've seen it do some damage to fish because it's usually quite thin. When they roll in it, you can rip scales up pretty good. So I tend to use the bite wire. I have used heavy fluorocarbon leaders like I would use for muskie fishing and conventional gear. The problem is with our lightweight flies and a 100-pound test fluorocarbon leader, you lose all the action to your fly. It just dies. I tried going down to 50-pound and I'm getting bit off. So I do like the wire bite. I don't believe pike for the most part are too spooky from a little bit of wire. So I start at 18 inches and I either use, there's a couple different ways I attach my fly. One is with a quick connect, like a little snap, fly snaps or whatever they're called. There's a lot of them on the market. I even think is it Rio now that's producing some I've seen.
Yeah, I use the Rio twist clips.
That's it, the twist clip. That's the one. They're fantastic. They're super easy on and off. If you're catching a lot of fish and your leader's getting chewed up a lot, I just use a jam knot. It's a really great way to just clip the wire off and tie it. It's 2 overhand knots. I probably should have put a diagram on here how it works, but it's 1 loose overhand knot and 1 tight overhand knot that just goes through the eye of your hook and through the loose overhand knot, and you pull the loose overhand knot tight. Like it's
got another video on our YouTube channel actually.
There you go. Yeah, it's fantastic, and it actually even works in like heavier nylon, heavier fluorocarbon as well. Like it's a really strong knot. Surprisingly, just doesn't bind down. It can't bind down on itself like a normal overhand knot would. The great thing with that is you might catch 2 or 3 fish but between snipping off that wire and tying it straight again. So you might not even find the quick connect or the twist is worth it if you're catching a lot. So jam knot or the twist is great. I should mention too, cold water, like really cold in that 40-degree, 50-degree range. I've had a lot of luck with striped bass lines. They're designed for cold water. They're designed for big flies. Get them in a matching line weight. If you got an 11 weight, get an 11 weight. And I've had a lot of good success with those. One thing I didn't talk about on lines here is I'm generally using in the spring 1 of 2 lines, a full float or an intermediate line. I do generally fish an intermediate more often. It's just to keep those larger flies a little bit below the surface. Those boofords, big bucktail flies, anything like that, they tend to want to ride really high. So if you're using an intermediate line that you can cast it out, give it a 3-second count, it's 8 inches underwater, and you can start your strip. A floating line might cause that fly to always come to the surface. So depending on the fly style. As the season progresses into the 2nd, 3rd week, I've actually been known to create my own little short sink tips out of like straight T11. So I think you guys sell bulk T11, right? Or you used to?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. So buy yourself like 20 feet of it or whatever, and make like little 3-foot and 5-foot sink tips. The T11's like 6 inches per second. Do a perfection loop in one end and a nail knotted to a loop, or need 2 perfection loops on either end, whatever works. And that short 3-foot section is just easy to put on and really drop that fly really quick without having to run like a 15 or 20-foot sink tip. Because in the shallow water, I don't want a 20-foot sink tip because that's just going to end up in the weeds really quick. So as far as I've seen, I haven't seen a pike line with a 3-foot integrated sink tip. So generally they're quite a bit longer, like the depth charge lines and all that kind of stuff. They're made to really get down. So that little tip there works really well for me. What else do we need? Long pliers, obvious reasons. If you look at that photo of that pike on that fly line box, you can see a couple big nasty canine teeth hanging out. Keep your fingers away from them. I take them out with pliers at all times. I can't think of a time where I'm in there, just even if it looks like it's on the outside of the face, like just a quick pull with pliers is good. All it takes is one quick little nick from that tooth and you're gonna be bleeding pretty good, so they're sharp. Also, all their teeth are angled backwards in their mouth, so if they get a hold of you, it's really hard to pull your finger out without causing more damage. So long handle pliers are key. They got big mouths and they can often take it quite deep. Stripping basket, in this one I've just got a little snap of a stripping like base plate, a plate you can put on the front of your boat. A basket on your waist also works well. If you're in a boat, I do really like these plates. They're nice because they're like, you can do a full strip, like a 3-foot strip without hitting your hand off a stripping basket, which can be quite annoying. And it just gathers your line and keeps it from blowing into the million line traps that seem to be on a boat. It's your tackle box latches, it's your seat bases, it's the cleats on the boat, it's your trolling motor pedal. There's everything to catch. So having those really just allows the line to gather up and not blow around too much. The bolt cutters are also really key. That really got into, I would say, popular with muskie anglers, probably back in the 90s when people really started to use big lures and big hooks for muskie. And we were really focusing on catch and release, starting to focus on catch and release. Often these flies are just in a very, they're in deep, they're in the gill rakers. If you just snip the hook, your fly might now no longer be usable. But you've saved that fish, right? And it depends on where you're fishing. Like if it's a 27-inch pike and it's hooked deep, I'm probably going to take it home. Like, if it's hooked really deep and it's bleeding, it's just going to come home with me. But if they're 40 plus inches, you want to take care of those big fish. So quick snip with the bolt cutters. They're also great from personal experience when you grab a fish and you forget there's a trailing hook and you get a trailing hook in your hand and the front hook's in the fish still and they start shaking their head, you can snip the wire joint or the hook off completely and separate yourself from a 20-pound fish thrashing its head. Handful of flies, I often say don't get too carried away with them. I'll get into flies here in a bit, but if you get some, some whites, some chartreuse and fire tiger looking colors, some orange and blacks, some just straight blacks, you probably got everything covered. If there's a large sucker presence in your lake, maybe you want something brown, olivey kind of colored. It's good to go. And I already talked about it, but don't forget your bite wire. You'll go through a lot of it on a normal day. So if you think, oh, I've got like 3 wraps on this spool, I'm good for the day, you're probably going to want to have an extra spool of it at all times, because it does kink up pretty easily. But this is what it is. And one thing I didn't talk about there is jaw spreaders. There's that image down there on the bottom right. Those are very useful. Pike have a very strong bite. And when they take it and they won't open their mouth, there's not much you can do to open their mouth. I've been on trips where we forget them and they're utilizing a second pair of pliers to kind of open their mouth, and it works, but the jaw spreaders are much nicer. One tip about your jaw spreaders, lash them to your boat. Put on a 6-foot leash and tie it to something, because you'll hold on to these pike, you put the jaw spreaders in, they'll shake their head and they'll throw them right in the water. Happens to the best of us. I don't know how many pairs I've lost until I realized that. It's unfortunate how many pairs I've donated to a lake. So lashing or putting a float on them or something like that can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I know people who do that with their nets too.
Yep, definitely. If you're solo or something and you have your net, not a bad idea at all. Putting a float, like even a length of pool noodle just on your net handle, will keep it from going to the bottom. Speaking of nets, get one that's large. Don't try to use your walleye net or your bass net. If you at all have the chance of hooking into 40-inch fish or even 35-inch fish, you want a decent net, something with like at least I'd say a 34, 36-inch hoop diameter. Yeah, so 3-foot diameter. These fish, you need room to keep them comfortable in the water. Similar to trout, I don't like taking them out of the water until it's time for a photo. The great thing with the long, deep basket on most predator nets like that is you can see the boat in the image. Like you're quite high up off the water, you're freeboard, so you might have 1.5 feet, 2 feet to the water line. So you want it long enough or deep enough that the fish can sit in the water and the net handle is in the boat while either you or your partner holds the net or stands on the net so it doesn't go away. The fish doesn't take it on you. So a decent net is also really key. Hand landing them is totally an option. When I was guiding up on Lake of the Woods for all my years in university, all those old school diehard guides, they were hand landing every pike in muskie, it seemed. Tough guys, but probably better for the fish if we all learned to use nets.
Probably safer for you too.
Sorry, what was that?
Probably safer for you too.
Definitely safer for you, and you're going to land more fish.
Just before we jump ahead, we had a question. Is the twist and melt with lighter method effective for securing those Rio nylon coated wires? You can do it. If anyone's not familiar, you could just literally twist wire back over itself and then singe it with the lighter, and there's a plastic coating on the wire that'll like fuse to itself. I don't do it myself. I don't know about you, Matt. I don't think I trust it as much as what I do.
I mean, I personally don't trust it. I'm sure, if you've had experience with it and you do, go for it. I'm not going to tell you how to attach your fly. Personally, I'm a big fan of a knot.
The thing is, well, like when you do that, it's a lot of weight, right? Like that's a lot of extra wire in your leader. And so if you're trying to fish slow, you've got that much more weight dragging your stuff down.
That's true.
Like even if it's strong off the bat, I couldn't help but be worried that a fish would like be gnawing on the plastic that's fused together and like stripping it as I catch each consecutive fish. I'd be testing that all the time if I was doing it.
Yeah, that's fair. One thing I have done I didn't talk about is I have played with like crimps and stuff as well, and had great success with crimps leaders. They're quick and easy to do in the boat. Just get yourself, most pliers have a little crimp notch in them, so you can do it on the water, on the fly if you want. And that eliminates the snap altogether. That eliminates the jam knot. Like it's just through the crimp and then just clip the crimp off every time. And you can buy 1,000 crimps for really cheap.
Sure. I will say that jam knot is like stupid easy and it works really well. Like I use it for my muskie and stuff too, and it does not fail.
No, I'm amazed. I mean, you learn all this time when you're learning to fly fish or fish in general. An overhand knot is like 50% line strength, right? But in wire, it doesn't seem to affect it one bit. But even still, it's an overhand knot that can never fully tighten up because there's another piece through the middle. So that's why it works so well. I've even messed around with it, fishing it for like brown trout on streamers. If you're running 15 pound, just the jam knot quick, I cannot break it. Like, it's surprising how strong it is, and it makes a really quick and simple loop knot. So good question though with the twist and melt. I've personally never tried it. I have seen it done. I've seen a lot of saltwater guys do it and stuff like that. But just personally, not me. So when it comes to approaching these fish, there's a couple different ways you can do it. Wading in a boat kind of covers everything, whether you're in a canoe or a boat or a raft or kayak, whatever, or if you're just wading in a river or a lake. The big thing is you're gonna be able to get quite close to these fish before you see them. So if you're walking at all quickly, you're going to spook every fish. And all you're going to be left with is a nice waving tail saying goodbye, or an eruption on the surface. So walk slowly. And as it goes with any wading, just try not to drag your feet. Try to walk like a heron. Like I tell people, don't take your feet out of the water, but pick them up off the bottom and place them. You'll be able to get a lot closer to the fish. If you're in the boat and you have an electric motor, keep it on low speed. And keep an eye out for fish at that 30-foot range if you can, if the water's clear enough and the sun is in your favor. In either situation, get yourself close enough to present an accurate cast. Accurately casting one of these wet socks of a fly can be a real challenge. Even with a short leader, they tend to kind of wave left and right a little bit more than you would expect because they have a lot of weight to them. So, no need for long casts. I would say, even when I'm fan casting for pike, most of them are 30 to 40-foot casts. I'm getting close to structure. I'm not bombing casts out there. And if I'm sight fishing, that 30-foot range seems to be the sweet spot. Always start away from the bay or away from the structure or outside of the bay and work your way to the back. Don't, in this situation, you can see I'm in this like early wild rice flat. That's great, but like, don't rush right there. That was after we fished the whole river mouth and worked our way in before we jumped on out and got in. That's definitely the juiciest spot for the time of year we were, but we picked up like an extra 15 fish working our way in, which was awesome. Like I said before, pike are lion weight predators. Look at the cover you're fishing to identify the good ambush points. So, fan casting is one thing, but every time you're making a cast, well, put it somewhere that you're actually thinking about where you're putting it. Look for the edges in the weeds, those transition zones, any fallen timber, anything that can allow that fish just to get comfortable, feel protected, and lunge out and grab your fly. Most of the time, or every time I think I've fly fished for pike, 90% of the time it's a visual strike. You see that flash, you see that fish turn. And why I'm saying that is most of the time it goes from sitting still to hitting your fly and turning in like a 3-foot section. Like, it's not chasing your fly. Muskie will follow your fly a lot of time. Pike just love to just go for it. If you get it close enough to them, they're going to get up to about 3-4 feet away and they're going to hit that accelerator so fast, and it's just going to happen out of nowhere. And most of the time you're mid strip and you don't even have to do anything, and the fish is already on. But they're not going to follow your fly, generally speaking, unless they're pressured. Most of the time they're just going to hit it. So, but if you're sight fishing for them, this is when it can become challenging. Make sure you're casting in front of and beyond the fish. Don't try and put your fly right on their head. Strip that fly to them or across their body. More importantly, don't swim the fly. If you can choose the orientation of the fish, I don't want to swim my fly straight at the fish's head. I want to swim it on like a perpendicular line. It gives you best profile on the fly. Not many bait fish are going to swim right at a hungry predator. They're going to swim past one. And if you see a fish at all get a little excited, it spins its body slightly, it opens and closes its mouth, its fins twitch, start playing with different strips. Maybe speed it up slowly, see what happens. Most people always want to speed it up when the fish is following, but in cold water, often the best way to get them to eat is get them interested on the strip and then kill the fly. Just let it crash into the bottom. And I've seen so many times on a pike will come over, just hover over your fly and look at it. After it sits there and looks at it for 2 to 5 seconds, give it a nice short, quick strip, and that fish just has no option but just to lunge out and eat it. It's really important. Just don't cast on top of them. The next thing I want to talk about, and I can even use flies as an example for spring fish, is use flies that push water, but also flow. That's important. So like the Buford, I'm sure if anybody muskie fishes, this is kind of the new, well, not the new, but it's like one of the more popular flies you're seeing out there. It's that platform with the big water pushing head. You'll see on a lot of experts, whatever guides are throwing that kind of fly. This one here is a little bit more traditional. So it's bucktail all through the head. And it's all just bucktail throughout the body, and then some synthetic fibers in the tail. But the ones I like in the spring incorporate bucktail, but then the head is actually like craft fur, folded back on itself. So it doesn't push as much water, but it also, when it's like just crashing into the bottom, there's craft fur throughout this. I use craft fur brushes with bucktail as support. The craft fur will just breathe even when that fly is sitting still. I even, the way these are tied, they're generally tied to ride kind of level. So there's glass beads on the wire that's joining the two hooks. Like this is just a 2-aught hook and a 4-aught hook. And they're pretty, small in terms of boofer. That's about 8 inches. It's not like a 12 or 14-inch one you'll see for muskie. But when you strip this fly and it goes left and right a little bit, it's just going to sit there and those fibers are just going to breathe a little bit. It's going to add life even when it's not moving. So something that flows and just moves when you're not doing anything, because these fish are cold-blooded. They're usually moving slow. Oftentimes you just have to kill that fly and just let it slowly crash into the bottom, and that'll get a reaction. When I'm fan casting, I'm stripping slow and fairly long, like 12 to 20-inch strips, I would say, just a nice constant strip. Short jerk style strips, or when you're using your rod tip, is better when the water starts to warm up and those fish are in the mood to react and chase a little bit more, and their metabolism's higher. One thing though that I always watch for is those underwater dust clouds. That's a great indication that big fish are near. Unfortunately, you spooked them, but it is letting you know that you're onto something. So if you start seeing, like, why is there all this dust? Like, what's going on? Just watch your surroundings. Just then find somewhere that's similar and utilize the same approach. And if you slow down, you'll probably be successful. So this is like a perfect example of some sunny water, sight fishing conditions, really shallow water. You're in that 2-foot range. We were just watching fish. It was fantastic. And this one's from way up north, up in Nipigon, but like even up on Georgian Bay, there's plenty of opportunities where you can jump out on these like rocky, hard bottoms, like sandy bottoms, and work your way into these bays. I have, in full transparency, have had people come down their dock and say that I'm trespassing in their bay. I always treat landowners with respect regardless, but I do always inform them like they don't own the water. So if I'm walking around the bay, you're safe. Just keep, don't cast at people's docks and stuff and throw out suntanning and stuff like that. But these back bays, sometimes just getting out on foot can make a difference between catching, a couple and catching more and bigger fish. So utilizing your waders, which isn't something you'll see a lot of conventional anglers do as well. So it's something that's a little bit different. When it comes to fly patterns, the patterns, they'll all be varied, but they're all kind of similar. For the most part, they're all bait fish based. So with the odd exception of some surface flies. So utilizing material like EP fiber, slinky fiber, craft hair, bucktail, schlappen hackles, big fly fiber. There's so much stuff you can use and have fun with it. Like there's platforms and you can go from there. So, small 4 to 5 inch synthetic bait fish, here's number one, incorporating a lot of flash. That's going to look a lot like a smelt or some other white style bait fish. It's not big by any means, but it can, in those cold water, early season situations, can work really well. The Murdich minnow works great for bass, but you can also upsize it to fish for pike, and it's very effective. Instead of using estaz on the head, that one is spun up with EP fibers, just stacked, and then colored with a Sharpie in order to get the two-tone effect. Works really well. And the great thing about the Murdich is it's got some great left and right action on the retrieve. It walks the dog really well. And it's a very easy fly to cast. There's not a lot of weight there, and it's not too air resistant. The third one there is the single yard sail. Fantastic fly. One of my go-tos. I love the look of it, the profile. It really just screams fish to me. The double yard sail is the big brother to it, and it Matt Grayevsky, right? That's his name. It's spelled Grayevsky, but it's Grayevsky. He's the inventor of the pattern. Fantastic tire, and it incorporates rattles, it incorporates foam to get it up near the surface. Insane left and right action on the retrieve. And then the big brother one has a really slinky, smooth swimming action. Probably the first fly you'll see me tie on most spring days is a bunny leech in black. Or at least one person in the boat's going to be throwing it. It's an easy fly to throw. It gets a lot of fish. It doesn't seem to eliminate the numbers of fish. Like some of the larger flies, really the small fish aren't interested in it. So those 5-6 inch bunny leeches can catch 40-inch fish, and they can catch 20-inch fish. So you do have to weed through smaller fish often with that, but it can be the best fly many days on the water. Large craft fur deceivers, basically. That's a double deceiver, but all craft fur, using some sort of like silicone or UV flex to keep the head material all back and smooth like that. You'll notice, we've got natural colors, some bright colors, some really dark colors. A lot of people will be like bright fly, bright day, dark fly, dark day. Sure, whatever works for you, whatever you're confident in. I find with pike is if you can just get it in front of them, that's most of the time what matters. But one thing I really like about a bright fly compared to those bunny leeches is you can see the fly, and you can see when a fish is following it. You can see when a fish slashes at it. It gives you something to watch. That double deceiver like glows in the water, and that chartreusey yellow with the orange head. You can see that at 50, 60 feet, no problem. And when it disappears, even if you didn't see a swirl, just strip set hard.
Right on. With there's a question I get from that, which is that, if you're fishing those bunny leeches, do you prefer to fish them off floating line so you can watch your line for takes?
Yeah, that helps too. Although most of the time I'm fairly tight to my flies, I'm not letting them run on a slack line too much. But yeah, floating line for sure. Most time I'm fishing bunny leeches, it's in 2 to 4 feet of water. Floating line will work perfectly. Some of them I incorporate like a couple, maybe 20 turns of 0.02 lead wire just to help them get down a little bit. That one's got bucktail incorporated into it. That's a great option. It still helps reduce fouling of the hook with the bunny leech. The other option is straight rabbit, like a crosscut zonker strip or not crosscut, whatever, all the way up. Those tend to be a lot heavier to cast, but they sink a little quicker, and they, you can stay tight to them a little bit easier. So you might not need to incorporate lead wire. But yeah, floating line generally with those, you're right, because sometimes they do just suck them up. The big thing is I'm never letting my fly pause for 5-6 seconds, usually, unless I can see it. If I'm just fan casting, it's get it out there, let it sink a little bit, and then just nice constant 1 foot strip, 1 foot strip, 1 foot strip. And sometimes the hits are so subtle, like you won't even believe it. You all of a sudden strip and there's a little bit of weight, and you strip into it and you're like, oh no, that is a fish. And then you get the big head shake. Other times they smoke it and come out of the water, and there's no denying you hit a fish. But regardless, I almost prefer it when I don't see the meat because you don't pull it away from them. Like all of a sudden they're there. That's perfect. That's what we want to see, especially when people are learning. Because if you've never sight fished before, seen a fish swallow a fly or eat a fly like that, you can react too soon and pull that fly away, almost like fishing a surface fly. Some more flies to look at. The El Diablo. It works really well in fire tiger, works really well in white. It's another aggressive fly, moves left and right. Another one of Matt's flies, the slip and slide, I really like. It's really stiff, provides an amazing jerk bait action. We talked a little bit about the craft fur Buford, which is 8, and then the true bucktail Buford. And this is a good example. You can see the head. So the bucktail Buford tends to be a little more of a flat face, and on the strip, it's going to slick back, and then those hairs are going to stand back up, causing the fly to stop and really spin left and right without moving too far forward. The craft fur one, which is almost more like the bulkhead kind of style fly, the way it's tied, will allow it to, on the strip, kind of glide left and right. Like it's going to move a foot, 2 feet, versus the traditional Buford that on a 1 foot strip might only move forward 6 inches and turn 6 inches. Like they're pretty aggressive. But also, these all involve quite a few different materials and tying techniques. Keep it simple. A bucktail deceiver, fantastic fly for pike. It's nothing but bucktail and flash. This one's got a little bit of purple craft fur mixed with black at the head just to provide a little bit more movement, but like super simple. And the great thing about a lot of these, they're synthetic based, they're bucktail based. They're pretty durable. Like you'll be surprised. Even a fish like a pike that's got a mouthful of teeth, these flies stand up. Game changers, everyone knows what a game changer is nowadays. They're a great option. in that 5 to 7 inch range. They swim really well. They catch a lot of fish. They're a pain to tie sometimes. They take a long time, but there's nothing, you can't deny the action you get out of them. One of my favorite materials, unfortunately, it casts like a wet sock, is Icelandic sheath. It holds a lot of water, but does it ever provide an amazing like profile? Like it just looks perfect and it blends in together really nice. And there's heavier materials out there like rabbit strips and stuff, but it's a good option. Those two 12 and 15 are the same platform, just different kind of colors. Talked about the Whistler already. Nice, generally small fly that's really flashy. Tie it in many colors. That one's Fire Tiger. Is when I was growing up conventional fishing, Fire Tiger, Rapala, Husky Jerks were fantastic for pike. So that's kind of what I'm trying to imitate. And then the one that everyone loves to fish is poppers. E-socks on surface are amazing. That's an articulated one that's got a 40 mil shank in the front, and a 4-aught hook out the back. Lots of craft fur, lots of shopping and flash with a big popper head. They don't cast very well at all. They spin your line up like crazy. Fish them on a floating line is what you would think, but I generally fish them on an intermediate line, which allows you to get a bigger pop because the line's under the surface. So that's something that a lot of people are shocked at. You would think surface fly, fish a floating fly line. Fishing intermediate fly line will get that popper to go down underwater 4 to 6 inches and then come back up, and it looks really good. Drives them crazy. And I think that's it for flies. But one thing I want to note is in my fly boxes, which are generally Plano trays that I've just got loaded with flies, like, you know, that's kind of my standard pike fly box, a lot of those, is I've always got a bottle of some sort of CA glue, fast setting glue, and a ton of extra eyes. Something about eyes on a pike fly, it drives them crazy. I feel like it performs that much better the minute there's an eye. So the eyes are the first things to fall off your flies, no matter how much epoxy you put over them, they do fall off. Just put a new one on. It's super simple. Just a dab of crazy glue, drop your eye in place, and your fly's back in action.
Awesome. Is there a certain circumstance that you'd reach for a popper in?
Generally speaking, it's improving weather. So you're getting that warming trend. Those fish are starting to show you they're aggressive. So they're hitting your fly moments after the fly hits the surface. You're watching them chase your fly down. And maybe when you're fishing 6 inches to a foot under the surface with most of the streamers, and those fish are rushing up from underneath and just inhaling it, that's when I might be like, oh, maybe it's time for a popper. The only reason I go to a popper is the hits are that much more thrilling. Like you probably will catch more fish fishing subsurface, with exceptions, you know, to everything, but it's pretty exhilarating when you watch it, even a 30-incher come out of the water with a 10-inch popper in its mouth. Like it's pretty cool. There are exceptions to that fact, and I'm going to go back, lean on my muskie history a little bit. But when the water warms up in early June, well, depends where you are, late June after they've kind of opened, there's a lot of like young like waterfowl on the water, and muskie love eating small ducks and things like that. Same thing with pike when the water's acceptable, when the water within temp range. So you're fishing June and the water's still pretty cold and you're seeing lots of little ducks scooting around the water. Not a bad idea to throw on a popper and pull that thing through pretty quickly. You'll get some of the most savage strikes you'll ever see. And they almost always they don't just sip it. They usually come completely out of the water with the fly in the mouth. That's when you have to just like try to calm yourself and don't set the hook until that fish is back in the water and turned.
Cool. We had a question from Dave.
Sure.
I don't know if you missed the earlier section or not, but asking, just confirming if you're bringing a full intermediate and a sink tip line as your primary lines, and how much fish in a floating line.
Sorry, the last part there I didn't hear.
Oh, and how much, if at all, you're fishing the floating line, which
Right, good question. So I think earlier in the presentation, it is definitely my two most favorite are a floating line and an intermediate line, and then I carry interchangeable sink tips. Not like poly leaders. I make my own just out of 3 to 4 feet, maybe 5 to 6 feet at the longest of T11. I just find that's a nice compact tip, which will allow me to turn the fly over easily still. With the exception of when you're starting to fish into the summer. This is a spring talk, but summer, you're definitely going to want to look at the depth charge lines to get those flies down 5, 6, 7 feet, 8 feet, even more if you count it down with those 20 foot sink tips. But yeah, I think if I had to break it down, I'd say 75% of the time I'm fishing intermediate, 25% of the time I'm fishing a floating. Within that 75% of the time I'm fishing intermediate, 50% of the time I got a sink tip on, a small sink tip. So
Cool.
hope that kind of answers
If anyone occurs to me want a simpler way to get into that kind of sink tip, you could look at something like there's the 5 foot or 5 foot OPST
Oh, that's perfect.
tips. You could probably do something like that. But yeah, Matt's right. I've done the same thing, just short pieces of like T11 or so.
Yeah. No, it's
Or
great.
maybe
It just allows
T8.
that-
If you're on 8 weight, maybe T8 is gonna be better for you.
T8 can be better. You're right. But if you also just have a short section, like it doesn't add that much weight. We'll get to casting, all this kind of stuff here in a minute. But in the end, no matter how much time you spend on your flies, they're all going to look like this eventually. That was my that fly, that white bucktail there probably caught 50 or 60 pike, and it was due for it to look like that, a little trashed. So it's kind of fun. Don't get too attached to your flies. So when it comes to casting big flies, kind of a funny photo of my good friend Nick when we're out pike fishing. Open up your loops when you're casting small sink tips, heavy flies, wind resistant flies. Try the oval cast technique. So come low on your back cast and come high on your forward cast. It'll just create a nice oval in the air, and keep everything apart. If you're casting traditional dry fly style, you're going to hit yourself with the fly, because keep in mind, these flies actually have some mass to them. You've got heavy hooks, you've got eyes on them, you've got rattles, you've got glass beads, and all this kind of stuff. That fly is going to come hit you in the back of the head, break your rod, all that kind of stuff. So low, like a low arm on your side, coming almost like a side cast, and then coming high over your head, will keep the loop open and allow you to present that fly fairly accurately still, because your forward presentation is still allowing that fly line to roll out straight. Water loading is something that's everyone loves to hate or love, depending on what you talk and who you talk to. It's definitely not traditional fly casting. We're also fishing for pike, like let's in muskie, like who cares? It works great. If you're struggling to get your fly out there, especially air resistant flies like boofords, anything like that, throw that back cast and get the fly into the water, but it has to be near the surface. You can't let it sink like 2 feet and then try to go forward. It's like a smooth acceleration. Just let it touch the water, almost like a Skagit cast, and then roll out. And that fly will load up with pressure on the water and really propel it forward. It also is a great way to save your shoulders. And for me, I don't know about you, but when I'm casting really large flies, no matter how much I try not to use my wrist, your wrist is still sore. Your wrist and your elbow can be really sore. There's a lot going on there. I'm probably just not the greatest caster. I could probably work on that. But it's hard to keep these 11 weights and such from causing your wrist to break. They're always going to want to break a little bit.
Well, I think part of it as well is like, even if your wrist isn't breaking, there's a lot to hold back.
Yeah, true. That's a good point. Tip weight.
Like on your back cast, I kind of try and lock the butt of the rod into here, but there's only so much you do in forward cast. So you're right, there's strain that happens there. I like to water load the other way, actually. I'll water load front instead.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, my water load is worth learning for sure.
Works really good.
Yeah, and a lot of sort of pike designed rods, like found was really getting into this these days. Like your standard 8 weight, 9 weight's not going to have it, but some 9, 10, 11 weights these days. Certainly ones from Remington, Sage, TNT, others. A lot of them have these little like elongated butt sections, a couple inches long, almost like what Nick has there, but maybe a touch longer. So you can kind of use 2 hands on, or even just a finger on the bottom here to help. You're not spay casting, but just 2-hand overhead casting, and that'll take a lot of strain off your wrist for sure.
Yeah. Even some of the custom rod manufacturers out there for muskie, like they make great pike rods. They're like a 4-inch rear grip on them, like a switch grip, and you can 2-hand cast them. But that little extended butt you're talking about is great because you can lock that into your forearm a little bit on the cast and stop your wrist from breaking. Also great, we didn't talk about it, but sometimes they love to follow and get you that second hand on the rod for a figure 8 presentation. So you can really set that hook hard with 2 hands when they eat it at the side of the boat. But still, when you're casting, try to be conscious of which way the wind's blowing, as we always should be in fly fishing, but really important with 4-aught hooks flying through the air. So always on your downwind shoulder if you can. And if that means you've got to spin your body and cast backhanded and dump your fly line over your back shoulder, that's a great way to do it. Like, don't have to always cast forward. I've had it all the time in my drift boat where people will say, oh, I can only cast off the right side of the boat. I'm like, well, just drop it on your back cast. Like there's your left side, right? There you go. Learning to haul is big. You don't have to be the best double hauler in the world to cast these flies, but even a haul on just that forward final presentation, just to snap that fly out there and turn it over can make a big difference. And failing all that, well, just pinch your barbs because you're probably going to hook yourself. And if you hook yourself with a 4-aught hook, it is not fun. A small trout fly, yeah, you can yank it out pretty good on the side of the river. These big ones, there's big barbs. So pinch those barbs. It's also, I don't lose like any pike when I'm with pinched barbs. I don't know. I don't know about you, but some
Well,
lakes.
they have long points, right? So it's
Yeah.
long back out there.
As long as
I
you
think
keep
the only
going.
time that I get in trouble more with muskie, where they get into weeds and get wrapped up a little in them, and then they get like a moment of slack line and
Right.
sometimes.
Fair.
But I mean, there's not a lot of weed cover usually this time of year, so I'd agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, now that you're hooked up, now what? Well, always strip set. Strip set. That's all you can keep saying to you. If you try to trout set these big flies with a 10-weight rod and an intermediate line with a sink tip, you're not putting any pressure on that fish. It's amazing how much stronger you are with just a strip set. A 1-foot strip set versus a 4 or 5 foot movement of your rod tip. It's not even comparable to how much more pressure you're putting on that fish. Load the rod right to the cork. Keep that rod low. Don't high stick these fish. Just keep the rod off to the right or left and just pull till that rod is bent right to the cork. They're big fish, so you really want to lean on them. Always maintain pressure, especially with barbless hooks. One thing when you're learning to net fish, I see it all the time, people chasing fish from the side or from the tail. Pike and the muskie as well also have that amazing energy boost at the final minute. They're long, they're like one whole fin, this entire fish. So one little kick, they can launch away from the net and potentially lose it. So wait for your opportunity, don't rush net jobs. And just like any game fish, we keep them in the water while you're celebrating, getting ready to release and take a photo. So big net with a big bag is going to be nice for the fish. And
Also, maybe a tip for anyone who's not used to handling like a bigger net is when you're trying to net a fish, don't put the net in the water first and then try and guide the fish to it. Have your partner ideally try and like gather up the bags, pinching the bag together, and then stab at it when you're ready to go. Otherwise, so much drag in the water trying to move that net around, you'll never get where it needs to be.
You got it. The only time I'll ever put it in the water first is when I'm solo.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And you have no other option. So in that time, I'll just to kind of go off topic a little bit, but I'll put the net in the water and I'll put the net between my legs, fight the fish to the net, get the fish over the net, and then just sit down and I'll lift the lever right up over them. And it works a lot of the time, but I have also lost some of the biggest fish in my life because I'm by myself. So if you can find a friend to go pike fishing with, I highly recommend it. Or a good guide, one of the two.
I had a question. Do you strip set on poppers?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I do. It's not, even though, the excuse with strip setting often is with streamers because you're subsurface and you're going to apply more direct pressure. A lot of the time with pike, first off, they've got a really bony mouth. There's if you have ever seen, a pike wash up on shore, or if you've ever kept one, if you take a look at their head, like it's just bone. There's very small areas for you to get a hook. So I watched it once before, and I'm not going to be able to quote who it was, but I watched a video on the comparison between a strip set and a let's say a trout set, lifting your rod.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean.
Who is that?
I think I know the one you mean. I feel like it was somebody from Sage.
It very well could have been, or Rio or something, but it was like whatever rod weight it was the individual holding the line, and the individual set the hook trout set, and his arm kind of went like this, and he literally applied maybe a pound of pressure. Like there wasn't that much. Yeah. And then he had him hold it tight, and he strip set and he pulled him off his feet, and it was still just with like a 6-weight. Like it was just like, wow. And it was he never moved the rod, just a good strip set. So you were able to puncture that fish's mouth a lot easier, potentially through the bone, or find a soft spot a little easier. The other thing is you're going to miss them, or the pike is going to miss your fly a lot of the time. So if you're trout setting, specifically on a popper or near the boat, and you lift that fly out of the water, it's behind you. If you strip set, a 2-foot strip set, that fly's only shot forward 2 feet. If you kill it, a lot of the time that pike's going to come back for round 2. Not every time, but often. But that is a really good question, because it is a surface fly, so you would think trout set.
Totally. Mind you, you're using intermediate lines. There's still a lot of resistance on that.
Exactly.
Too.
Yeah.
But yeah, like if everyone's ever curious, I do it all the time with people teaching. The difference is that get a friend to help you out and hold the line as they strip set versus just trout set. And I think obviously it varies depending on what the rod's made of and stuff, but like even your average 10 weight is only capable of applying, I feel like ballpark, maybe 10 pounds of pressure in trout set just bent before it breaks. Like it's not a ton of pressure that they can actually apply. It's only, it gets to be a good amount of pressure once you start finding it off the butt of the rod and you really utilizing the drag and reel. That's when your 10 weights can land big tarpon and stuff. But yeah, really the only way to drive it home is going to be with the strip set.
You got it.
And these are big gauge hooks too.
Yeah,
They need some pressure in their own right.
And the wire on the hook's heavy, like
exactly
at a sharp point, but that gauge, like you said, is does require some solid pressure to get it in there. One thing I do try to keep when I'm tying my flies is keep your gap pretty clear though. For the most part, things with bucktail and stuff will move out of the way on the hook set, but you don't want to be, you want to hook big enough. Like my favorite hook's a 4/0 usually, 3/0 or a 2/0 for a stinger, but most of the time it's 4/0 for my head flies. It's just got a lot of gape for your flies. So that one's, right in the corner of the jaw, kind of where you want it. You can control the fish pretty well. You got a good chunk of meat. It's not going anywhere. And that's, you can see a barbless fly. It's going to come right out. Caring for the fish. Here's where I talked about using the net to keep the fish wet. So that fish is comfortably in the net. You can, high five, get yourself organized and calm down because, you have a very good chance if you just freshwater fish, if you're out pike fishing on a lake, you might catch the biggest fish that you've ever caught. So keep that in mind. So you want a big net to not only land the fish, but also to allow you some time to collect your wits and hold on to the fish. Caring for the fish is also important when it comes to holding the fish. They're big. They will kick your butt if you let them. If you notice, a lot of the way people hold pike, myself included, is by utilizing the gill plate to hold the fish. If you look at anything, if anybody puts a photo up online by accident holding a trout by the gill plate, you're going to get ripped a new one. But holding the pike, it's just a really good way to control the fish and protect it as well as you. The head is full of sharp teeth. So first off, if you don't hold the head and it kind of spins around and gets a hold of you or whatever, it can cause a little damage, not to scare anyone, but you want to make sure, control that head. If you pinch inside the gill cheek, the gill plate, you'll notice if you look underneath, you'll see the gills. There's 3 separate sets of gills. You don't want to go in between the gills. That's key. Those are the gill rakers. For one, you're going to damage the fish, but number 2, your fingers are going to come away tore up. Like they're going to be bleeding everywhere. So when I teach people to hold them, I'll hold the fish like I am, and then I'll get them to follow my hand up and inside. All you should feel is something that's a couple millimeters thick of flesh. It's not like you're way in there. And then you'll use your thumb to pinch on the outside of the cheek, right where your fingers are. So you kind of like pinch really hard like that. From my experience, I don't know if there's any truth behind it, but it almost relaxes them in a way. Like it kind of puts you in control, and then you give them a good hard pinch there and they kind of just admit, okay, you've got me type thing. If you're holding them loosely, they're going to flip and they're going to flop because they know they can get away. But if you give a good firm grip on them, they're good. Holding them horizontally is key. These are big fish. If you hold them vertically, they've never been in a gravity environment really in water. So you don't want to let the organs slip down and crush them. So holding them horizontally is good. And if you can, hold them over the water because you are going to drop them. And if you drop them, it's better if you drop them in the water because then they can just swim away.
Yeah. I like to further your point about where to grip them on the cheek there, like or on the gill plate. There's probably a lot of good videos on muskie that you can find online. But I almost feel like when I slide my fingers up there, like there's almost a little bit of a depression on it, like a little, like almost slot you can.
That's a good point.
Settle into there.
I think the area underneath the throat is called the isthmus on a fish. And it's really key that you don't go all the way up to the top where the gill meets the isthmus, because then you're in the danger zone for yourself. Like you're going to be near the teeth. You're going to be more importantly near the gill rakers, which will destroy your fingers. I've got scars from it happening to me in the past. It's going to happen eventually to you. But like you said, if you put your hand in there and slide up, your thumb should hit below the lower mandible. It's hard to see on the photo here, but there is going to be a depression where the bone kind of comes down. You can actually see the bone structure on the fish's face if you look at it. And you want to pinch that thin spot. It's so thin, it's like a membrane. And that's where you're just going to grip on there, and you should have good control over them. And then they're just super slimy and a little stinky, but that's okay.
Yeah. You'll see some people, I've definitely seen people tail pike.
Yep.
And then support their belly too. They don't have quite, I would say, the same structure that like steelhead or salmon does. So they're pretty hard to hold on to by their tail.
Yep.
So you know, in a boat, I wouldn't feel super great about that. Chance of you dropping them, but if you're over water, you don't care if the fish slips away, I guess, before.
It's a great way to hold them too. A lot of people use that as their go-to, but they don't have that wrist, that solid wrist that you find on salmon and trout. You grab their tail and the tail just kind of collapses. So if you're going to do that, like I've told most of my clients while steelheading, utilize the bones on your hand to hold the fish. Don't utilize the webbing on your hand to like grab the tail of the fish. Like just change your wrist position. Hard to describe here, but apply the bone on your thumb to the top dorsal portion of the fish, and the bone on your index finger to the bottom portion of the fish. And you can actually get a pretty firm grip, but you really want to make sure you're keeping it firm.
Yeah. Now, I guess like one other final option for somebody, if you're not super comfortable or confident with the gill plate, would question, what size pike would you say is too small for gill plate holding? If there is one, I haven't found it. Like,
yeah, every
sub 15 inch, like tiny.
Yeah.
20-inch fish you can do it on, sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But you could go with Boca grips are kind of controversial because they usually pierce the fish's mouth and it can do some damage. But something like there are the what are they called? The Lippa for Life from Rising, which is kind of like almost like just a clamp, like a hemostat, but it's got just like round, smooth ends. So I haven't tried them, but they shouldn't pierce at least. And yeah, if you're not super confident, it could be an option.
Yeah, and I've seen people utilize like mechanics gloves and stuff for them. I try not to use gloves on any fish, so don't either. I wouldn't recommend it. Back in the day, that was the thing everybody did, was a pair of gloves inside the gills. You won't get gill raked. We probably killed a lot of fish doing that. Another way is just pinching them. If they're smaller, that 30-inch range or less, you can pinch them behind the gill plate. Do not hold them by the eyes like all the old school guys did growing up. I saw so many pike photos with, look at my biggest pike, and there's a 40-inch pike held by the eyes. The fish is going to die, no problem, no doubt about it. But if you pinch them behind the gill plate, you can get a pretty good grip there as well. Or just put them in the net, unhook them, and release them. If you catch one by mistake and you've never handled a big pike, there's no harm in taking a photo in the water. Think of the fish first and just let it go.
Totally, absolutely.
And this is why I like barbless hooks. This fish was actually from Nipigon. I would say that streamer there is like 7-8 inches long. And I would say 50% of our fish, we're taking them not to the throat, but like deep. This one is wrapped around the gill rakers. You can clearly see them where the gill rakers are, which are those lines, vertical lines. The fly is wrapped around the gill raker. So this fly, 2 ways to get rid of it. One is a pair of bolt cutters and just snip the hook. Number 2 is to actually go in the gill plate backwards, go up underneath and pull the fly out, pull it right through the gill, clip the wire and pull your wire out. It comes out right away. Also a reason why I generally, even if I'm allowed to, I generally clip the stinger hook on my pike flies. They often take them deep. Like they're not subtle eaters. They're not nipping, generally speaking. But that one thing I didn't talk about on flies is incorporating the use of removable hooks or replaceable hooks. So that's becoming quite popular now, incorporating like a shank with a split ring and like a single hook off of that, or people are using small treble hooks, whatever, and they work quite well because you can cut that hook and just replace the hook later. If you're confused by what I'm saying, Gunnar Brammer does a lot of videos, and a lot of his flies are now utilizing treble hooks for muskie flies. It's pretty cool, replaceable system, so that when you have to cut your hook, your fly that you spent 2-3 hours tying sometimes isn't garbage. So that's a cool way to do it. Otherwise, that's pretty much all I got. Not sure if there's any other questions or not, but you're on mute, Chris.
Sorry. There was one, might need a little clarification on that. Is the hookup bad on these guys, or is single barbless good to go?
So
I'm not sure if that's just
they
meaning
take them, they usually take them so well that like single barbless is no problem. Even when I don't have to. So if I'm fishing around here, like I don't have to fish single barbless like I do if I go to Nip again. But I choose that way. They come out so easy, not damaging any fish. The other reason is when you're fishing for big pike, inevitably you're going to find 26, 27, 30 inchers that are going to take a fly real deep. And you're going to see a lot of blood if you're using barbed hooks. So barbless single hook. Also, what I just tell a lot of people when I've switched to barbless almost 100% is it's really, we're just out fishing. Like you lose a couple fish here and there. It's probably not the fly and the barb that why you lost that fish. Probably would have lost it regardless. It was a pressure issue. It was a hookup issue, a hook set issue. The fish just didn't get a hold of your fly right. Like they do miss targets sometimes a little bit, you know? So I don't think I've lost a fish on a barbed hook that I would have not lost on a barbed hook, if that makes sense, you know? Yeah, I think it does. But yeah, barbless all the way.
Cool. Well, thanks, Matt. That was awesome.
Good. I hope that hope everyone got a little bit of something away, took something away from this. I love them. They're a great species of fish, and they've been on the radar of gear anglers for a very long time. And they're starting to get their attention I think they deserve to the fly anglers, fly angling community. So lots of fun, provide a nice long season, and they get really big. So.
Absolutely. And you're doing some guiding for pike this spring as well.
Yep. Yeah. So spring's still got some dates available. Like I said, Georgian Bay opens May 1st. I think weekends are pretty much all full at this point, but reach out if you have questions. And then I'll be up in the Muskoka region and around Simcoe County as well. They all open at different times of the year, but all in May. So whether it's the first, second, or third week of May, they'll be around, and the fishing is usually great. Lots of fun and visual strikes, big flies. If you like streamer fishing for trout, you're going to love streamer fishing for pike. It's fantastic.
Wicked. Can't wait to get back at it. And if anyone wants to reach out, your contact's up on the screen there. It's your
You got it.
website.
Yep.
So please get in touch with Matt if you're interested. I know that he's helped me a bunch over the years doing this in this area, and his advice has always been bang on. So
awesome.
Definitely a very good resource there.